7 years of postgraduate education and microphones still stump me half the time. So here we are. So I'll start really. Again, I am Trevor Sutton. I am a researcher at Columbia University in New York City, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this morning's session on trade winds for climate, Pacific perspectives at COP30. And today we're going to be discussing how trade policy and trade cooperation can support climate mitigation and adaptation. And this is a topic that for a long time was relatively peripheral in the international climate conversation, but recently has become a subject of very lively, often heated debate. And so before we turn to our esteemed panel, I just wanted to take just a few minutes to offer some small context for those of you who may be a little bit new to this issue. And I think the best place to start is with the observation that the trade system that we have today was not designed with a particular concern for or attention to climate. There are over 60 legal agreements that make up the WTO. Not one of them. The large majority of free trade agreements that are enforced today. And so, given all this, it's unsurprising that historically the trade system has been a key enabler of carbon-intensive economic activities. If you look at the most traded goods in the global system, you'll find oil and gas. You'll find heavy industrial products like steel and cement that require a tremendous amount of energies to produce. So recently, this has started to change as a growing number of governments have recognized that an effective response to climate change must incorporate trade. But the challenge is, at the moment, there's no agreed upon set of rules, no common playbook for turning trade from a climate liability into a climate solution. And so where you might expect to see cooperation and collaboration, often we found conflict and tensions. Now the story of debate around climate and trade has tended to center the concerns of and interests of major economies. That is, those large economies that collectively account for the large majority of trade in goods and services. But personally, and relevant to this event today, I think that this focus on the major trade actors risks overshadowing and leaving out of the conversation really valuable, essential perspectives.
You need to.
Sorry.
You need to
really talk into it. Oh, wow. Okay. Could you hear me before? Okay, good. Thank God. As I was saying, I think the focus on really the large trading nations risks overshadowing some really important and valuable perspectives on the trade and climate debate. It's not just the world's major trading nations that have a stake in greater coherence between the trade and climate regimes. Now, to the contrary, I would personally argue that it's small island developing states and other LDCs that are on the front lines of the climate crisis that have the greatest, really an existential interest in a trade system that delivers on climate action and that ensures equitable access to the goods and technologies needed to adapt in a warming planet. Which brings me to the particular focus of our conversation today, Pacific perspectives on trade and climate. As many of you in the room are no doubt aware, the Pacific region has produced some of the most powerful and effective advocates for international action on climate. But the Pacific nations' views on trade issues have received comparatively less attention. And this is despite the fact that the Pacific nations have played influential roles in advocating for key sustainability measures in the trade space. For example, the recent WTO fisheries subsidies agreement. So my goal today and the purpose of this event is to bring those Pacific Island perspectives on climate and trade front and center. And we have a superb panel to do that for us. So I will introduce them briefly, and then they will each offer opening remarks. We have immediately to my right, Will Nankervis, Australia's ambassador for climate change. To Will's left, we have Salome Tukuafu with the Pacific Regional Environmental Forum. And then finally, all the way on the right there, we have Zarak Khan, with the director with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. So with that, I'd like to first turn to Will to offer some remarks.
Great. Thanks very much, Trevor. And great to be on this panel with Salome and Zarak. And thanks to all of you for being here. Particularly strong showing from our Fijian colleagues. So thanks, Fiji, for turning up for this, what I think is a really important discussion, which is the links between trade and climate. And it's one that as we've heard, I think is particularly important for Pacific Island countries, just because of the importance of the issues of climate change for Pacific Island countries, and the importance of the voice of Pacific Island countries on climate issues, and just how intertwined trade and climate are, but possibly trade issues don't get enough attention or the attention that they should in the climate context. So part of the idea of this event is to raise awareness of the importance of trade issues to meeting our climate goals, our ambitions to keep 1.5 degrees within reach, and look at how we can amplify Pacific voices on this really important issue. So I think there's one statistic which is really important and powerful here, which is that 1/4 of global CO2 emissions are embedded in traded goods. So 1/4 of the world's emissions embedded in traded goods. So I think that emphasizes to me how important this discussion on the interface between climate and trade is. So a few examples of the connections. There's so many ways trade affects climate. Trade really drives what we produce as countries and what we consume and what we use. Everything we see around us, most of the microphone I'm using, the materials in this pavilion, they've all been imported and exported. So what we produce as countries, what we consume, trade is really kind of integral to that. But there are a lot of emissions embedded in those processes, in the way that things are produced, and then in the way that they're shipped and transported around the world. Also, trade spreads innovation. So the new technology, new clean technology, energy technologies that we're going to need, more efficient technologies to drive decarbonisation, they all come through trade. And the way trade is facilitated, the barriers to trade, they can all have an impact on who those technologies reach and how. Another dimension to this is subsidies. So an estimated $2.6 trillion is spent annually on subsidies. And these can have a real impact and a real harmful impact on the environment. So we're thinking of things like agricultural subsidies. So they can drive inefficient agricultural production, which is resource intensive. Things like industry subsidies, which can drive massive overproduction, which can have a huge carbon footprint and significant contributions to emissions. So those are just a few examples, but these issues of trade and climate and emissions really deeply linked. Another dimension that kind of complicates this set of issues is the intense competition that we're seeing over resources and innovations that are going to drive new models of production and consumption. So here I'm thinking of things like critical minerals and technologies like semiconductors, solar panels, and so on. So lots of competition around access and production of those things. And also really intense competition for the capital, the investment that is needed to drive production of those new technologies. So really complex dynamics around these issues. And that means it's not always easy to harness trade to drive our mitigation ambitions. It's a complex picture, which makes discussions like this all the more important. So a couple of words about Australia and what we're doing on these issues. And I'll touch quickly on three things. The first is Australia wants to use our renewable energy potential to establish new low emissions industries. Australia, we have an abundance of wind and abundance of sun. I think we have the highest kind of photon count in terms of solar radiation, or one of the highest in the world. So we really want to harness that to that renewable energy potential for low emissions industries. That's really consistent with our NDC. So our new NDC announced a couple of months ago a 62 to 70% reduction on 2005 levels by 2035. It's a really ambitious but also achievable NDC, but central to us being able to meet that NDC is new renewable harnessing our renewables for the industries of the future. The second element in which we're really working on these issues, or the second area, is the multilateral system. And this is an area where we're already working really closely with our Pacific Island country partners. And I think one powerful example of that is fisheries subsidy reform. So working together on fisheries subsidy reform in the WTO, we had a real victory, Pacific Island countries and our partners. And we're looking to move that forward and conclude the full agreement on that fisheries subsidy reform. So that's an example of the way we can use the multilateral system. A lot of challenges with the multilateral system at the moment, but the way we can use the multilateral system to drive progress on these issues and use our collective voice. And that brings me to my third point, which is just working really closely with Pacific Island partners on these issues. Of course, we're deeply bound by trade, Australia and New Zealand and Pacific Island countries. So we've had, Pacific Island countries have had tariff-free access to Australia for over 40 years under PACER Plus. Two-way trade is really strong. In 2024, two-way trade was up by almost a quarter from 2019 levels. And last year, Australia imported $9 billion worth of products from Pacific Island countries. So that means our consumers in Australia have access to more Pacific kava, cocoa, vanilla, more of that's arriving to the benefit of the Australian community. So we're deeply bound by trade already, but we want to work more closely on addressing these issues of the links between trade and climate. We want to raise awareness of these issues, and we need stronger international discussions about how we can turn trade into a net positive for emissions reduction. And that's discussion on things like subsidy reform, facilitating voluntary tech transfer, and just on these issues, it's really important to have a distinctly Pacific contribution to those discussions. We know that the Pacific has really for many years been the moral compass on climate. So it's important that Pacific voices are raised in all forums where trade issues are being discussed. So we've worked really closely in the Pacific Islands Forum on these issues, including working with partners to develop the region's first trade and environment sustainability agenda. So we hope to see that come to fruition in coming years, but really driven by the interests of Pacific Small Island developing states. And overall, we want to work with Pacific partners and globally for stronger collaboration on these issues, trade and climate change. So we hope today's discussion can provide a modest contribution to that dialogue and raising awareness and cooperation between us on those issues. Thank you.
Do I have this? Yeah, well, thank you so much, Will. That was fantastic. And I really particularly appreciated your point about constructive engagement around issues like subsidies and voluntary tech transfer. I feel like often the discussion around climate and trade focuses on all the tensions and the issues we can't get past, but there really are so many positive areas where there can be real progress made. And it sounds like Australia and the other Pacific Islands could serve as a template for many other parts of the world on how to do that. So we'll now turn to Salome.
Hello. Sorry. It's not working at all. Thank you. Sorry. Hello. Okay. Testing. Good morning and warm Pacific greetings to everyone. Maybe just my quick way of acknowledging some protocols. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Permanent Secretary Savendra Michael. Also like to acknowledge His Excellency Mr. Will Nankervis, Australia's Ambassador for Climate Change, and of course Director Zarak Khan of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Will and Zarak, I'm very honoured to share this distinguished panel with both of yourselves. And on behalf of the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, wish to thank the Government of Australia for hosting this timely dialogue and who is a very important partner to SPREP. I'd like to commend this effort to build coherence between global trade and climate change regimes, issues that are of critical importance to the Pacific, given our region's extreme vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, as well as the structural challenges that we face that are closely linked to trade. These include our high dependency on imports, our geographic isolation, as well as our narrow economic bases. This event also reflects the strong spirit of collaboration between our crop agencies that aligns with the principles of the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, particularly around alignment and harmonization to support sustainable development and avoid the duplication of efforts across the region. I think most of our audience are aware of what SPREP does, but just for those who don't know what SPREP does, SPREP was founded to promote cooperation in environmental protection and sustainable development in the Pacific. Today, SPREP is the lead regional agency supporting our Pacific Island countries and territories in addressing the triple planetary crisis on climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. In this context, today's discussion on climate and trade coherence is both timely and necessary. In order to frame my interventions that will come during the discussions today, I wanted to found these on three important dimensions. The first is the importance of aligning trade and climate with emerging global trends. Trade, of course, as Will had mentioned, contributes to climate change through emissions-intensive sectors like transport and production, but at the same time is itself impacted by climate-related disruptions. The recently launched Baku to Belém roadmap by the current COP presidency and outgoing presidency acknowledges key shifts in the global financial landscape, including rising interest rates and the doubling of external debt servicing costs for developing countries over the last 10 years. These realities reinforce the need for both climate and trade systems to respond to the macroeconomic constraints facing Pacific small islands developing states, and to ensure that trade policy contributes to, but doesn't undermine, climate resilience. The second dimension that I wanted to focus on is ensuring that there's recognition that our vulnerabilities are multidimensional. The Pacific Ocean covers 30% of the Earth's surface. However, our countries remain among the smallest and most vulnerable nations. We face mounting threats from ocean acidification, marine pollution, sea level rise, and extreme weather, which impact our livelihoods, food systems, and economic stability. Our structural constraints also mean that over 90% of our trade flows are seaborne. And finally, in order for Pacific SIDS to fully benefit from preferential trade mechanisms, green subsidies, or liberalized trade on climate-friendly goods and services, our enabling environments must be strengthened. At the global level, this means coherence across multilateral regimes, which Will had mentioned, the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the CITES Treaty on the Trade of Endangered Species, and the recently adopted Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, or BBNJ Treaty, as well as negotiations towards a Global Plastics Treaty. All are multilateral environment agreements that intersect with WTO rules and obligations. At the regional level, our work is framed by the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, which our colleagues at PIFS lead on, under which SPREP leads on the oceans and environment thematic area and co-leads on climate and disaster. The Noumea Convention, or the Regional Seas Treaty, and the Waigani Convention on harmful waste management provide important legal frameworks as well, while initiatives like the Weather Ready Pacific program, which our Pacific leaders endorsed as the vehicle for the Early Warnings for All initiative, offer practical mechanisms to build climate and trade resilience, including through early warning systems. At the national level, updating trade legislation provides an entry point to integrate environmental and climate considerations. And I'm glad that Will had mentioned the important sustainable trade agenda that our colleagues at PIFS lead on, and that which we are looking forward to working in partnership to progress. This can facilitate circular economy initiatives, sustainable supply chains for tourism, for example, agriculture, fisheries, and other productive sectors, as well as to promote low emissions infrastructure development. These transformations will require financing. They'll require technical assistance, as well as technology transfer. And we look to development partners like Australia to continue supporting our Pacific countries in integrating climate and trade policy. And hopefully, of course, beyond this COP, possibly at a Pacific COP, furthering these discussions. I look forward to contributing today to what I'm sure will be a very rich and dynamic panel event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful intervention. And I particularly appreciated your point about linking trade to climate resilience. Often the trade and climate discussion focuses on, for example, pricing carbon into the cost of traded goods or enabling broad deployment of renewable energy technologies. But the response to climate change is about so much more. It's about helping countries, especially vulnerable countries, adequately manage and look after their own citizens' prosperity and security in a changing climate. And I think that really needs to be part of the trade and climate conversation, so it's wonderful that you were able to elevate it here. And now we turn to Zarak Khan.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Bulivinaka, and good morning to everyone. I'd also like to join Salome in recognizing my fellow colleagues on the stage, Ambassador Will, Salome, as well as Trevor, and also recognize Permanent Secretary Sivan, who's in the audience. So I think when I was preparing for this panel discussion this morning, I was in a conundrum because I knew that by the time after Will spoke and Salome spoke, they'd have all the excellent points that I fully subscribe to. And I think through my interventions, I particularly wanted to focus on the role of the Forum Secretariat in the Pacific. And so the Pacific Islands Forum was established in 1971. So we've been around for more than 50 years. And in fact, many people aren't aware that the reason that our founding fathers and the forum leaders established the forum in the first place was to do with trade integration. So one of the first deliverables from the Pacific Islands Forum in the 1970s was its first regional trade arrangement called SPATICA, the South Pacific Regional Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island countries, which actually was part of the trade on bananas, on many different products, garments, textiles, and really gave a strong footing for our private sector in the region to be a lot more closely integrated, and was a precursor to a lot more other issues on trade which we're able to advance over the last several decades. And so trade has always been in part of the DNA of the Pacific Islands Forum. We are the regional organization that's mandated to support our Pacific countries when it comes to delivering on regional trade policy, supporting trade negotiations, and convening of the Forum Trade Ministers meetings, which happens every 2 years. But really what's been missing as part of the puzzle, in terms of the trade puzzle in the region, is this trade and climate nexus. So I think I'd like to commend Australia, firstly for convening this panel. I think for many of the audience and those on the stage here, we've attended many COPs, but trade and environment has always been an elusive topic. We haven't really covered it in that much detail. And obviously, one of the biggest proponents of this is the private sector, in the region. No? And for the Pacific, it's always been a challenge when it comes to private sector development. I think you have some exceptional countries like Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa and Tonga, because they're bigger countries. But for a lot of our atoll nations in the Pacific, a lot of our smaller countries, it's very difficult for them to encourage entrepreneurship, private sector development, and get trade going. And so for us at the forum, while trade is probably one of the 3 areas where regionalism is at its strongest, including security, including climate change, it's always been a challenge to try and a common thread across all of our member states when it comes to the issue of trade. And so obviously the capacity building, development of supply side and other issues is always on our agenda. But what we've tried to take is a commodity-based approach, but also a policy-based approach to trade. So I'll cover the first one. So in terms of a commodity-based approach to trade, for the Pacific, we don't have a lot of products that we export or trade in. It's a very narrow export base. So pretty much a lot of the countries engage in fisheries, as you know. And the other product that is quite popular is kava. which the forum works on quite extensively. And so for the kava commodity, we've come up with the regional kava strategy and roadmap. And so we work with more than 3,000 farmers across the Pacific region. And one of the biggest things that we've managed to achieve over the last several years with the support of member states is having kava listed as a product on the Codex Alimentarius, meaning that now there are effective standards on kava production and kava harvesting, sustainability standards in terms of what our farmers in the Pacific adopt to ensure that they can maintain international best practice. And we're also very grateful for the Australian government, which started the pilot project on kava imports. So over the last few years, the Australian market has opened up for us, the European market to a certain extent, and obviously the US and other markets in the region. And so kava is a very important commodity for the Pacific. And as Salome was mentioning, agriculture is really at the heart of the nexus between how we protect the biodiversity in our environment, how we ensure that sustainable production takes place, sustainable harvesting takes place. And a lot of this comes through education, through capacity building, and through partnerships that we have with international organizations and our donor partners like Australia. Coming to fisheries as well, for the Pacific, we host probably more than 60% of the world's tuna resources. And so offshore fisheries is a very important commodity for us. It creates a lot of jobs in the Pacific, but more importantly, it supports the national budgets for our Pacific Island countries. So for countries like Kiribati, Tuvalu, our atoll nations, excess revenue from fisheries comprises more than 60% of their national budget. And so sustainable fisheries is very important. And I'd like to commend the work that the Foreign Fisheries Agency does, the parties to the Nauru Agreement does, to try and make the Pacific a model for the rest of the world. And so we're the only region in the world where fisheries takes place all throughout the year. So we're not a seasonal fishery. Fisheries happens right throughout the year. And for most of our stocks, they have been classified as sustainable. And this was not done by accident. It required the vision of our fisheries ministers, our leaders, the excellent work by FFA and by the PNA and other partners to ensure that the stock is conserved and is managed in a sustainable way. I'd like to use the parties to the Nauru Agreement as an example. They, for example, use a very innovative system called the Vessel Day Scheme in terms of selling fisheries rights in the Pacific region. The reason why it's unique is because it's one of the few fisheries in the world that's not managed according to maximum sustainable yield, but instead maximum economic yield. Meaning that for the countries that are part of the PNA, there is a profit-based or market-based incentive to make sure that they don't overfish and there's no overcapacity in the fisheries. So they use the model of scarcity to try and drive up prices and ensure that for their skipjack, for the yellowfin, for the albacore, and some of the other key species that they have, it's maintained at a level that is sustainable for future generations. And so they've managed to, for example, increase fisheries revenue from $90 million back in 2009 to over $500 million right now, while maintaining fisheries largely at the same level over the past decade, which is an excellent example for the rest of the world. And the final area probably I'd touch upon is tourism, which is a very important service-based industry for most, if not all, Pacific Island countries. And I think this is probably an area where Pacific countries face the greatest stress, just like other countries in the world which are dependent on tourism. Obviously, there's an issue of over-tourism, because of the fact that for many countries, including like Fiji and others, tourism is a very large or dominant part of GDP. For Fiji, for example, it's directly or indirectly responsible for more than 200,000 jobs, in terms of supporting livelihoods across the country. And so, for governments in the region, it's a challenge balancing the economic objective of creating jobs, preserving employment, maintaining, contributions to the GDP, but also protecting the environment, protecting our blue economy, our oceans. And so, I do commend PS Siven and Fiji for the excellent environmental regulations and the policies, they have in place in Fiji, which I think is a regional leader. This is something that we're trying to replicate across other countries as well, to try and work with organizations like SPTO and others to really advance the topic of sustainable tourism. So it's not really about the numbers and the quantity of, or the number of arrivals that we have in the countries, but it's really about increasing visitor spend and ensuring that more money is retained in the economies of the region. Because for a lot of our countries, we have tourism operators that are from overseas countries. So there's a lot of leakages in terms of money leaving the country. And obviously, we need to support our MSMEs, our women-owned entrepreneurs, and get more of the tourism dollar to be spent in the local economy, especially in ecotourism and other sustainable tourism-based activities. The last topic that I just wanted to very quickly cover is build on the point that Will was making in terms of the excellent achievement at the WTO by our Pacific countries, with the support of Australia and New Zealand and our Pacific Islands Forum Geneva office on concluding the negotiations on Fish 1, which was the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement 1. This is really important for the Pacific because I mentioned fisheries is really the lifeblood for a lot of our economies. And for many of our countries, they're not WTO members. So we only have 6 countries from the Pacific which are WTO members, and 8 if you include Australia and New Zealand as well. So we're very grateful for the financial support from the Australian government, which keeps our Pacific Islands Forum Geneva office running, actually, and supports the negotiation process for a lot of the work that we do at the WTO. And so Fish 1 was very important, but we are trying to conclude a much more comprehensive regime on fisheries subsidies, as Will was pointing out. The negotiations are still progressing. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of bottlenecks and hurdles being thrown by some of the distant water fishing nations, which actually exploit and take advantage of a lot of the loopholes that we have, not just in the Pacific, but other fisheries across the world. And so overcapacity, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing still remains a huge problem for the Pacific, and also unfettered subsidies, which are funding bigger fishing vessels, vessels with bigger engines and bigger capacity, so they're able to stay out, in our EEZs and high seas for a lot longer. And so these are areas that our leaders and our ministers are looking at quite closely. And so international standards, international regulations really are important to us because we're small countries. And many of our countries, as I mentioned, may not be members of some of these organizations. So we lean quite heavily on Australia, on New Zealand, on some of our bigger countries to advocate for the smaller countries in the region. And so we've taken a policy-based approach, as I mentioned, where a lot of the trade agreements that the Pacific Island countries are negotiating now have trade and sustainability or trade and environment chapters in those trade arrangements. Particularly some of the modern trade arrangements that we have, like PESA Plus, for example, with Australia and New Zealand, and also the economic partnership agreement that we have with the European Union. So we have very high standards on labor, for example, on human rights, and particularly on protecting the environment. So this really compels a lot of our foreign direct investors who are coming into the region to ensure that even though there may be an absence of national policies or regulations in some of the smaller countries, at least they are bound by an international treaty when it comes to laws and regulations. And it creates a much more conducive environment to ensure that environmental goals that our leaders have set and our ministers have set can be achieved. And I think lastly, I'd just like to point out that for us in the Pacific, standard setting is quite a new concept, especially at the regional level. And so our ministers, as Will was mentioning, have agreed on a trade and sustainability agenda, which our trade ministers have approved, but also our forum leaders. This is something that we're working with SPREP on quite closely. So in the first quarter of next year, we're doing a scoping study where we're hoping to identify what are some of the pressure points that our countries are facing when it comes to trade policy and the environment, when it comes to the impact of trade on biodiversity, on marine pollution, for example, and some of these other areas, and see what are some of the key priorities that a trade and sustainability agenda can encompass. So we'll have a regional trade and environment workshop as well, convened next year. And we're hoping that we can present this agenda at the next trade ministers meeting in partnership with SPREP. Thank you very much, Trevor.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And yes, when I was invited to moderate this, I thought, do I have any products from the Pacific Islands in my home in Brooklyn? And the one that I had was kava. I have kava from Vanuatu and from Fiji. And I have to tell you, it's particularly after a long day, it's improved my life immensely. And I had no idea it was part of the Codex Alimentaris. Wow. Well, there you go. We've got about 10 minutes left. I had 2 questions I was thinking of asking, and maybe I'll toss them both out there, and the group can decide whether they want to respond to one or the other, or tell me to come up with new ones. But the first is, I wanted to pull again on this thread, Salome, about resilience. And you often hear from developing countries in the climate system that there's disproportionate focus on mitigation relative to adaptation. And I'm wondering, I should say that is also true in the trade and climate context. It is, again, largely focused on mitigation. I would welcome your perspective and the perspectives of the rest of the panel on how we can better leverage trade to assist countries with climate adaptation. And my second question is, well, given that the Pacific region has really been such a moral anchor, a powerful advocate for an aggressive and effective response to climate change, how do we take that leadership, how does the Pacific region take that leadership and leverage it, use it as a platform to advocate for a more effective trade system that contributes to climate targets?
Oh, is this on? Okay, it is. Thank you, Trevor, for the question. I think I might start off maybe addressing the point that you made on the importance of adaptation. So the question around resilience and adaptation and what the specific needs are for our particular region. Before I maybe hand it over to Will and Zarak to bring in the trade integration. I think in terms of identifying what the specific resilience and adaptation needs are for the region, of course these are grounded on our NDCs and NAPs, but SPREP convenes the Pacific Climate Change Roundtable, which of course has support from Australia. And this is a platform that allows us to identify as well as to validate against our NDCs and NAPs what those particular needs are for Pacific SIDS. And the needs are, from what we've found, very much focused at the sector level. And I acknowledge Zarak for making the point around the diversity of our Pacific Island countries. For our atoll nations, very much a focus on coastal protection as a priority. But the other important needs center around water, which of course has impacts across different sectors, food security, health, connectivity in terms of transport, and communication, which includes through early warning systems. Similarly with our large island states like PNG and Fiji, who also have small and remote island nations. I think having set that foundation around the particular needs, I might hand it over to Zarak and Will to speak about the trade implications.
No, thanks, Trevor, and thanks, Salome. I think when it comes to the issue of trade integration and the leadership role that the Pacific plays, I think one of the important examples that we can share this morning is something that we've covered a little bit earlier. But the WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies is one of the few multilateral agreements at the WTO that's been agreed to in the last few decades. And this wouldn't have been a possibility without Pacific leadership. So, when we talk about smallness, when we talk about our remoteness, when we talk about, the lack of our resource endowments and whatnot, despite these challenges, the Pacific was actually leaned on by the key negotiators and the chair of the WTO fisheries agreement negotiations a couple of years ago to be in the green room and to actually drive the negotiations and lead it to a successful conclusion with the support of Australia and New Zealand and our other partners. And so we may be small, but when we come to the issue of multilateralism, this really gives the Pacific a bigger voice at the negotiating table. And this is why in the Pacific, we are huge proponents of the issue of multilateralism, which is why it's very sad for us to see some of the issues that are being faced by the WTO at the moment. It's very sad for us in the Pacific to see this issue of protectionism, of the tariff wars that are happening around the world, particularly because of the fact that it's very difficult to build multilateralism. It took generations, it took decades, but it takes just probably months, weeks to break it apart. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing at the WTO. So what we'd like to see, I think, from the Pacific region when it comes to the issue of trade and environment, when it comes to other issues that are linked to this, is really stronger support from our development partners, other bigger countries, not just in the Pacific but around the world, to commit to multilateralism, despite the headwinds that it's facing in different areas. Because this is the best way to support small island developing states from the Pacific, from other regions in the world, to ensure that our voice is heard. Because once countries start acting in groups, the rich will get richer and the poorer will get poorer, unfortunately. And in the issue of trade and environment, this will probably be more so, particularly when it comes to the respect for regulations, respect for policies at the national level, and really the type and quality of investors that we bring into the Pacific. And so I'd like to maybe put my trade commissioner hat on. I used to be a trade commissioner before in Australia. And I'd like to say that Australian investors in particular are probably some of the best investors that we have in the Pacific region, particularly in terms of their respect for sustainability standards and the work that they do in terms of working in partnership with our governments to ensure that these investments are implemented in a sustainable manner. And I think this is really an example that we can probably take to other countries as well, and other investments that we get into the region, whether it's in tourism, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in fisheries and whatnot, is really ensuring that we have a rules-based order when it comes to implementing investments in countries, and we have respect for national laws as well. Thank you very much.
Well, I think Salome and Zarak have said it very, very well. There's not a huge amount for me to add, but maybe I'll just pick up on that last point that Zarak made about using the voice and the voice of Pacific Island countries and that moral authority to play into these discussions on trade and climate. We can amplify the profile of these issues and try to strengthen and support the role of the multilateral system and Pacific voices in the multilateral system in addressing them. I think we want to hear those Pacific voices in all forums where trade is being discussed. And of course, there are some that you think of, immediately when you think of Pacific Island countries. So we've talked about them: fisheries, subsidies, the plastics negotiations, for example, tourism, Zarak, you mentioned, but also in broader discussions. So discussions on reducing harmful subsidy practices, where the links might not immediately be apparent, but we know that they're so important, the links between those issues and climate. The question also, when we look at the issue the other way around, of using green subsidies in an efficient rules-based framework and enhancing access to climate-friendly goods. So I'll just end by coming back to that statistic of 25% of carbon is embedded in traded goods, which means that we, with our goals on climate, really can't afford to ignore this aspect of and the contribution of trade to emissions. And I think from Australia's perspective, what we can really do is, as we do in so many other ways, back Pacific climate leadership on this topic and make sure we're working to amplify those voices, those very strong voices of Pacific Island countries on trade and climate issues and that interface. So hopefully this discussion, again, makes a small contribution to that really important and significant goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that is a perfect way to close. We're at time. So I really want to thank all of our panelists for a fantastic conversation. And if you'll permit me, I just want to say at the end that it really has been a real privilege for me to be up here with you. As someone who's spent his whole life in the East Coast of the United States, I have had very few opportunities to engage directly with the Pacific Island peoples about their values and aspirations. And that's the beauty of COP. I don't think I would ever have this opportunity. And so I hope it's the first of... Oh, do we have questions? Oh. Sure, are we allowed to go over the 9:50 mark? Okay, great. Well, sorry, I didn't see we have a question. Apologies.
Sorry, morning colleagues, Michael from the government of Fiji. I think I just wanted to ask this very pertinent question because this conversation is so important, not only in these spaces, but also inside the negotiation rooms. You know that UTM is one of these agenda items that has not been agreed, mostly because of the push that it is should be dealt in the WTO space, does not have to come to the climate change space. But of course, all three of the panelists have mentioned that, and including the moderator, about the nexus between trade and climate and why we should bring it here. My question is a little bit pivoted towards just transition. Given that we all are in that space, and as brothers, as friends of the Pacific, Australia and the Pacific, helping with this transition aspects or aspirations. Maybe a food for thought, or something we can discuss on the side as well, is how you said, Ambassador, in terms of looking at the greening framework, And for I think one of the main discussions for just transition is what does just transition mean for the Pacific? It's not about just dumping green technology that does not work for the Pacific, cannot be contextualized. And while I don't like to use the word dumping, it's almost seems like technology from Europe about green shipping, you know, that is, you know, associated with unfettered subsidies and so forth. These are things that, you know, seem to be secondary in nature, but for us as policymakers, these are things that we keep asking ourselves, how do we explain to our citizens about these things? So maybe this is something in the future that we can also link in terms of the trade discussion, in terms of what are the pathways of just transition that we should be looking at from a trade perspective.
All right. Thank you very much for the very rich presentations and input that you shared. I am Mulanda Jimmy Juma from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You talked about multilateralism. You shared a very good practical experience on how we can move from theory to practice. Because one of the challenges that we have in these meetings and the policies and decisions that are made at COP level and other forums is moving from theory to practice. And so I was wondering, as we live in a connected world, how do you plan to share your knowledge, your experience with the rest of the world, including Africa, for example?
I think we have to wrap up, and perhaps lots of questions, and perhaps that's an indication that I and we at the panel spoke too much and should have gone to questions earlier. So apologies for that. But I think Secretary Michael's question on just transition and where trade plays into that, such an important one and such a huge discussion. And the question of sharing these experiences with the world and Pacific experiences exchange with Africa, another huge and really important one. So maybe we can continue the discussion after this session. I think we're really getting the wind up from the pavilion here, but let's chat about these really important issues, and thanks so much for your interest.
Thanks so much. I'll end there. I will just say that I would love to bring the Pacific perspective to New York one day, so maybe we can connect. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming.